I want to suck your blood. You heard that right. In this video, I tried beating Terraria as the vampire class. This mod adds a whole arsenal of vampire knives, each with their own unique effects, along with accessories to boost the power of these weapons. Will I, as a vampire, become strong enough to suck all the monsters until they run out of their sweet nectar? Well, you're about to find out. Spawning into the world, I noticed right away that there was a bar next to my health, which resembled blood. As a vampire, this came as no surprise, but at the same time, I was unsure on how to fill up this blood meter, let alone on how to obtain my first vampiric weapon. So I figured I'd start chopping down some trees for wood, and go on from there. After collecting some wood, I began traveling to the right side of the world to see what I could find. And below a living wood tree was a spear that had godly on it, which I decided to use until I got my hands on my first real weapon. There were a couple of slimes around the area, so I killed them, and they dropped ricochet essence, which were resources for upgrading weapons specifically for knives. I also noticed that my blood meter increased. It wasn't a lot, but I now knew that killing monsters was the way to raise it up. Inside another chest, in the living wood trees were some lead bars, enough for an anvil, and I saw two new items I could craft, the chisel and hammer. I only had enough materials to make one of them, so I crafted the hammer, which was used to craft the knife workbench. This was the cornerstone of all knife related weapons. I finally had a clear vision of where I was going and what to do. I basically just needed more lead bars, so I went underground to look for some. Along the way, I stumbled upon the finch staff, some gold ores, my first life crystal, and I saw a chest right below me, but a tomb crawler just had to ruin it for me. I returned back, opened the chest, and received the ancient chisel that increased mining speed by 25%. Back on the surface, I went to the right even further, and found myself the aglet along with the lead bars that I needed, so I made the chisel, gathered some stone for a furnace, and was finally able to craft the knife workbench. It was time to get my first vampire knives, the copper knives, and all I had to use to make it was the copper short sword. This weapon only had a measly 1 damage, 4% critical strike chance, so I knew this thing was going to be the weakest knives in this mod. Not only that, it required ammo to use. I thought that I could just start attacking right away, but apparently not. So I used silver bars to make silver throwing knives, and when I was testing it, I realized that the copper short sword would have been better. The copper knives shot out 5 projectiles that dealt 1 damage each, so the max damage I could deal was 5, excluding critical hits. Back at the knife workbench, when I right clicked onto it, a window popped up showing me all sorts of upgrades I could apply onto my weapons. There was damage, critical strike chance, along with 3 special upgrades. A chance for my attacks to ricochet by using the ricochet essence that I got from slimes, the amount of enemies that my knives could penetrate, and increase to lifesteal. There was no point in upgrading the worst knives in the game, so I held onto my upgrade resources to use later. At this point, I still didn't have a weapon that's considered decent, so I did a little bit of research and found out that I could craft the jungle knives using only 16 jungle spores and 16 stingers. This had 7 damage, which by all means isn't a lot, but if you think about it, that's 7 times the amount compared to the copper knives. So I began killing monsters in the jungle. As I did that, I found the ancient cobalt leggings, band of regeneration, some more life crystals, and a bit later grabbed the cloud in a bottle, true spikes, and magic mirror. Eventually I farmed enough stingers and jungle spores, so I teleported back home, built a house to store some items away, and then crafted the jungle knives. I saw a zombie nearby, so I attacked it, and I was actually surprised to see how much damage and range this thing had. When the zombie died, it dropped a mortal heart, which you guys will continue to see as I kill more specific monsters. These could be tossed into a blood altar to be converted into blood essence. This was the blood meter that I mentioned before. I attacked more monsters around me, and noticed that the jungle knives could lifesteal for 1 point of health per hit, and to add to that, it applied a on-hit debuff which dealt 6 damage per tick. This was more than just a decent weapon, it was unbelievably good. I crafted the gold pickaxe, the grappling hook, and some armor for some more defense. One more thing to add about the jungle knives is its ability to attack through blocks. It just keeps getting better and better, although the range of it was reduced significantly. I continued exploring the jungle, finding the sus looking eye, a bunch of diamonds, enough for the diamond hook, and the remaining life crystals for max health. I returned home and began building an arena to prepare to take on some bosses. Once that was done, I crafted my first accessory, the makeshift whetstone, that increased critical chance by 15%. It had the lucky modifier on it, which gained an additional 4% for a total of 19%. My jungle knives now had 23 critical chance. While I waited for night to arrive, I figured I could take on the king slime. So I went to the Crimson, crafted a slime crown, and then summoned the boss back at home. My knives had a wide range attack, but since the king slime is quite large, I could land all 3 knives most of the time. When I defeated the boss, it dropped super glue that's used to seal energy inside of unstable crystals. I didn't know what that meant at that time, so I continued on. I built NPC houses and then waited until night to summon the Eye of Cthulhu. As I was fighting the boss, I figured out that my on-hit debuffs dealt more damage compared to the direct attacks of the knives, which I found to be a bit funny. Once the boss died, a gigantic heart dropped. This was a living heart, which was slightly different than the mortal heart. This is dropped rarely from regular mobs, but always dropped from bosses, and most likely will grant me more blood essence. With Crimtane bars, I could craft the Butcher's Knives that had more than double the damage compared to the Jungle Knives, but it required the Blood Butcherer, 10 Crimtane bars, and 5 vertebra. I didn't have enough Crimtane after crafting the Blood Butcherer, so I killed the Eye of Cthulhu once more. I then went to the Crimson, and killing a monster there dropped a Crimson Shard. 5 of these would create a complete crystal, which I assumed to be the unstable crystals. Once I had enough vertebra, I crafted the Butcher's Knives. This had 15 damage and could throw a cluster of knives that stuck onto enemies, causing bleed. Hearing all this, I truly believed it would be better than the Jungle Knives, but as I was testing it out, my excitement for it slowly diminished away. It's like Christmas when you're opening presents, expecting something crazy, but end up getting an avocado. It was now time to take on the Brain of Cthulhu, so back to the Crimson I went, built an arena, and broke Crimson Hearts to summon the boss. I started off with the Butcher's Knives, knowing that it was inferior to the Jungle Knives. It would be a total waste to not use it for a little longer. Afterwards, seeing the creepers were still alive even after all that time, I switched back to finish off the boss. The brain dropped a Crimson Crystal, which needed superglue to stabilize it, and collecting 5 shards created another Crimson Crystal. Back home, I crafted the Deathbringer pickaxe, the full set of Crimson armor, and then stabilized the crystals at a Crimson altar, becoming the stable Crimson Crystal, which was another upgrade resource for increasing lifesteal, but I decided to save it for later, just like with the Ricochet Essence. The Wall of Flesh was up next, and seeing that I still had the Jungle Knives, it wasn't going to be strong enough to take it down, so I needed better knives. That's when I stumbled upon the Starfury knives. It required the Starfury, weak Vampire Knives made from a stable Crimson Crystal and Iron Knives, and 15 Sunplate blocks. I made the Iron Knives first, as that was simple, and then combined it with the Crimson Crystal to make the weak Vampire Knives. It had 10 damage that could shoot 5 projectiles out, healing me for 2 points of health. Finally, a weapon worthy enough to replace the jungle knives. Now I needed the starfury, but since I had no gravitation potions, I had to look for small pools of water on the ground. This was an indication that a sky island could be above. I found the lucky horseshoe first, and because I was already at the dungeon and the next boss I was going to take on was Skeletron, I chose to build an arena. After that, I located the meteorite that fell earlier, mined it, and crafted molten knives that had 6 damage and reduced enemy defense, pairing it up with molten throwing knives. This wasn't going to be my primary weapon, but instead a secondary. Getting back on task, I found the remaining sky islands with the shiny red balloon and starfury. Back at the knife workbench, I made the starfury knives, which had 24 damage and could rain starfury blades from above, granting me 3 health per hit. Now this weapon was capable of defeating the wall of flesh. It was the next night, so I returned to the dungeon to summon Skeletron. But just like with the starfury, I had some trouble landing my attacks. But in the end, I was able to defeat it. From Skeletron, I received the extra finger. This was an accessory that adds an additional knife to my attacks, but when I tried it out, I still could only attack with 3 stars. Although it didn't work, I kept it just in case if I ever needed it later in the game. With access into the dungeon now, I grabbed the Shadow Key, Cobalt Shield, and the Muramasa. I wanted to keep exploring, but I received the message saying that the Goblin army was approaching, and right when I was about to teleport back home to take care of them, a monster dropped the Piercing Tip, which was the other special upgrade resource to increase the number of enemies my attacks could pierce through. After defeating the Goblin army, I saw that I was able to turn my Muramasa into the Sengo's Forgotten Blades, which had 11 damage, and upon hitting an enemy, it would gain rapid rotational force, moving in a constellation pattern. Right away, I thought this would be another contender to use against the wall, but the more I thought about it, the more I strayed away from that idea. The reason why was because of its low damage and unpredictability. There was one more vampire knife that I wanted to check out, and it was the bee knives. I was looking at what I needed to craft it and expected to have to take on the queen bee, but that wasn't the case. All I needed were some honey blocks and another iron knife, so I gathered some, but just because fighting the queen bee wasn't necessary, I did it anyways, because I wanted to see how good the Forgotten Blades were. And I was right. The weapon was straight cheeks. The damage just wasn't there, so I ended up failing. Bee knives were then made. It was cool and all, but the problem was the damage, like with most of the pre-hard mode knives. I tried it against the Eye of Cthulhu, and to no surprise, it was not good at all. The starfury knives were the way to go, and to increase my chances of defeating the wall, I decided to upgrade it by increasing the pierce by 2. Not only that, there was the whetstone that increased knife damage by 20%. With that much of a damage gain, I expected crafting materials to be a little more complex, but it was just sand, granite, silt, and marble blocks. I began collecting these blocks, and while I did that, I finally found Hermes boots. I made 3 whetstones total, kept one to equip as an accessory, and used the other 2 towards my starfury knives for a total of 33 damage. I was all set, so I started mining down to hell, found the Goblin Tinkerer, combined my accessories together, creating lightning boots, the blue horseshoe balloon, reforged my starfury knives to Unreal, and mined hellstone for the molten pickaxe. To juice up my weapon some more, I increased the chance for my knives to ricochet. I mean, I had a lot of essence, so why not? I went to the right side of the world, dropped in the voodoo doll to summon the boss. I absolutely made the right call to add pierce to this weapon, because it could now pierce through all 3 parts of the boss. After defeating the wall of flesh, I killed some enemies in hell for some living fire blocks. These paired up with hellstone bars created the fiery knives. It had 18 damage and burnt enemies on hit, but this was very short-lived as I now had all 4 vampire knives to craft the Knight's Edge equivalent, the Penumbra. This weapon had 30 damage and fire projectiles that returned on impact. The difference of damage was insane, from all those weak pre-hard mode knives to this absolute monster of a weapon. There was also the crit emblem that I received from the wall, which increased crit chance by 8%, that also acted as an upgrade resource. I broke Crimson Altars to spawn the hard mode ores, and after collecting enough ores, I made the Adamantite armor. There were no vampire armor, so I resorted to the melee version for as much defense as possible. With the remaining Adamantite bars, I made the Adamantite knives, which only had 17 damage. Quite low for a hard mode weapon. It fired 5 knives in a sinusoidal pattern, but this compared to the Penumbra, definitely had to stick with the Penumbra. Speaking of the Penumbra, because I farmed Souls of Night, I could upgrade the extra finger to the mechanical finger, granting 2 defense and 2 additional knives. This made my Penumbra even stronger, now being able to shoot 5 knives at a time. Next up, I wanted a pair of wings, so I killed wyverns for Souls of Light. I wasn't expecting this at all, but after killing a wyvern, it dropped its head. Turns out, it was a weapon that shot out 7 knives that attacked towards enemies multiple times. The wyverns also dropped a damaged version of their head that could be thrown into a blood altar for blood essence. Once I had enough souls, I made myself demon wings and then summoned my first mechanical boss, the Destroyer. I tested out both the wyvern head and Penumbra against this boss to see which was better, and for this type of boss, you just can't beat the wyvern head. It could pierce many more times. The Destroyer dropped hollowed bars, as do all mech bosses do, and I used some to make Excavator knives. This did not have any special effects other than the highest amount of lifesteal I've seen with the highest base damage. It was a solid weapon for sure. I then made the blood altar using obsidian, marble, and stone slabs with 4 stable crimson crystals. The altar is able to summon blocks, coins, enemies, ores, all exchange for blood essence. I enabled the Ritual of Midas, and holy crap, the amount of coins pouring out of it was mind-blowing. Copper coins use blood essence the slowest, while platinum coins use them the fastest. But I didn't test that out. Not knowing how fast it would drain was a risk I didn't want to take. It was even possible to spawn ores that weren't obtainable at the stage of the game I was in, such as chlorophyte and luminite. Lastly, I threw in my wyvern heads and hearts, but that didn't give me much blood essence as I'd hoped for. I summoned the twins on the next night using the Penumbra, so it didn't take long at all. As for Skeletron Prime, that boss took a while longer. With all 3 souls of the mech bosses, I crafted the pickaxe axe and went into the jungle finding the Plantera bulb. I only cleared a small area for the arena as I knew I wouldn't need a massive one. When that was finished, I broke the bulb to summon the boss, and this time I used the Excavator knives, and honestly, I should have used it from the start against the mech bosses. It was better than I thought it'd be. Plantera dropped the Blooming Terror, knives that had 3 stages to it. Stage 1, throwing out knives as usual, but has a chance to spawn spike balls. Stage 2, summon Plantera's soul to attack in the direction I aimed. This was my least favorite stage of this weapon because of its short range. And finally, Phase 3, which also summoned its soul to attack, but had a much further reach. Out of those 3, Stage 1 was by far the best. Next boss in line was Golem, so I made my way into the temple to summon it and used my newly obtained weapon against it. I returned back home to start up the Soul Eclipse to kill Mothrons for the broken hero knives. And I needed 2, so after grabbing those, I made the true Excavator knives. When the knives made contact with an enemy, it created additional Excavator knives, therefore hitting any enemies behind the enemies in front. The Umbra came next. It was very similar to the Penumbra, except it could now pass through blocks and had an extra projectile, but between the two, I prefer the true Excavator knives. I honestly wished I could have used them a little bit longer, but it came time to combine them to create the Terra knives. These knives combine the effects of both the true Excavator and Umbra minus the ability to return back to me. I reforged it to Unreal and then traveled back to the dungeon to take on the Lunatic Cultist. Honestly, if I really wanted to, I think I could have stayed in one spot to take down this boss because of how much health I was lifestealing. After defeating the Lunatic Cultist, I destroyed the Stardust Pillar. With the fragments, I could make celestial knives, however, I needed the vampire altar. The thing is, it required vampire knives in the Crimson chest, so I spent quite some time in the Crimson, killing countless of monsters until one dropped. With the Crimson key in hand, I went back down to the dungeon to open the Crimson chest for the vampire knives. With that, I made the vampire altar and then crafted Stardust knives. Knives that made contact with enemies spawned cells that attached and multiplied like crazy, but when attacking actual monsters, it fell short of the Terra knives. I destroyed the Solar Pillar next and created the Solar knives. Again, also fell short of the Terra knives, even worse than the Stardust knives. Then I took down the Nebula Pillar, but this time the Nebula knives were actually good. It was similar to the Terra knives as it created nebula blasts behind the first enemy it made contact with, but these blasts are able to home in. I destroyed the last pillar and crafted the Vortex knives. Attacking with this summoned a vortex that's attracted towards enemies, just like the Razorblade Typhoon. With all 4 celestial knives, I made the Astronomical Singularity that combined the 4 celestial knives effects all in one, which was honestly a huge mistake, and it didn't help that it had awful on it. That made me reforge it for a better modifier, which caused me to panic when Moonlord spawned. My inventory was a complete mess, and I didn't have the magic mirror on the right hotkey, so I took too much damage and ended up failing. I had to repeat the whole process of defeating the lunatic cultists again, along with the celestial pillars. This time, I was fully prepared, even having the nebula knives upgraded. Inside the treasure bag was the Star Wrath. Combining this with the Starfury knives created the Wrathful Star. With this endgame vampire knife, I just had to summon Moonlord again to test this thing out. So I did. Alrighty, that's it for the video. That was the Vampire class. I hope you all enjoyed watching. If you did, don't forget to leave a like. Comment down below if you have any other mod or video ideas you want me to try out. And of course, subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.